Have you ever wondered why a single weapons test in 1941 shocked British commanders so deeply that it forced them to rewrite their entire Pacific strategy? What kind of gun could be thrown into mud, buried under sludge, drowned in a water trough and still fire the moment it was lifted out? And how did the Owen gun, a strange Australian prototype nobody trusted, become the unexpected victor of a trial designed to break every weapon placed in it? It wasn't accuracy. It wasn't firepower. It wasn't reputation. It was survival, pure, brutal survival. The Owen gun endured an impossible torture test with such flawless reliability that the Sten and the Thompson looked obsolete in comparison. A weapon dismissed as crude had just embarrassed two giants of Allied engineering. To understand how this muddy miracle stunned the British High Command, we must return to the field where the impossible test began. The test field lay on the edge of a eucalyptus forest, where the ground dipped just enough for rainwater to gather and form a shallow basin of brown sludge. It was not a formal proving ground with paved lanes or polished benches. It was little more than a clearing with churned soil, scattered crates and a series of mud pits dug out the previous evening. A group of British officers stood near the edge, adjusting their caps against the early sunlight. Their boots sank slightly into the damp earth as they leaned forward to study the preparations. Everything around them carried the scent of wet dirt and eucalyptus oil drifting in the warm breeze. The Australian team had arrived earlier, hauling equipment from a truck that still ticked quietly as its engine cooled. Among them was Evelyn Owen, the young inventor whose name would one day define the weapon he carried. For now he looked more like a mechanic than a designer oil-stained shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes alert. He kept glancing back at the small green prototype resting on a wooden crate. The gun had a top-mounted magazine and a shape that seemed odd compared to standard weapons of the time. It looked simple, almost crude, but every line and part had been placed with a purpose that only a few understood. The British delegation had been instructed to evaluate the new design. Many arrived expecting to confirm their doubts. They already had the Sten for mass issue and the Thompson for specialized units. To them, the Australian gun felt unnecessary. As they observed the field, quiet comments passed among them, carried on the wind as light as dust. Their skepticism hung in the air, thick enough to sense without hearing every word. The mud pit dominated the center of the area. It was roughly rectangular, filled overnight with buckets of water, and stirred until the mixture resembled something between wet clay and sticky porridge. The surface moved slowly, small bubbles forming as pockets of trapped air struggled upward. A few meters away sat a deeper trough filled with water, clear near the top, but darkened at the bottom by loose soil. These were the tools of the test, cold, harsh, and indifferent to engineering pride. The Australian sergeant overseeing the setup walked from station to station, testing the firmness of the mud with his boot and making sure the water trough was deep enough. His movements were steady and calm. He had performed many field tests before and understood that weapons often behaved differently outside factory conditions. A gun's reputation mattered little when dirt was involved. Mud was the great equalizer, capable of revealing every weakness a designer hoped would remain hidden. The first weapon brought forward was the British Sten. It came in a long wooden crate lined with cloth. An Australian corporal lifted it carefully, wiped dust from the metal, and handed it to the test officer. The Sten rested lightly in his hands, its simple construction and side-mounted magazine giving it the familiar appearance every British officer recognized. The design had been chosen during wartime urgency, intended to be cheap, fast to manufacture, and easy to issue to large numbers of troops. The test procedure began with calm efficiency. The Sten was checked to confirm it functioned properly. Its bolt moved smoothly. Its magazine fed correctly. The weapon was clean and ready. A few controlled bursts cracked into the morning air, fading into the forest before anyone spoke. The gun worked exactly as expected under clean conditions. The test officer then approached the mud pit. He held the weapon at arm's length and lowered it into the thick sludge. The surface swallowed the barrel first, then the magazine, then the entire receiver. Only the stock remained visible. The mud clung tightly, pulling at the metal like a slow creature wrapping itself around prey. When the gun was finally lifted, heavy droplets slid off, but many remained stuck in the crevices. The test officer shook it once, then stepped back. The Sten was raised, aimed at a sandbank, and the trigger was pressed. Nothing happened. A dull click echoed across the clearing. The bolt had stuck halfway, unable to cycle through the mixture of dirt and water that now filled its chamber. Another attempt followed, this time with more force. The result was the same. The Sten, a weapon trusted by thousands of soldiers across multiple fronts, had failed almost instantly under jungle-like conditions. The British officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting only slightly, but the change was noticeable. They were not surprised, but the failure was still uncomfortable to witness. Next came the Thompson. The American design arrived with thicker steel and a heavier frame. Many considered it one of the finest submachine guns of the war. Its weight and reliability in urban and European environments were well known. The Australians checked it as they had the Sten, firing a series of clean rounds before moving toward the mud pit again. The Thompson sank into the sludge with a heavier splash, its bulk forcing the mud to ripple outward in small waves. When it was lifted out, the mud coated nearly every surface. The test officer tried to clear it with a firm shake, but the weight of the weapon made the process slow. He raised it toward the sandbank again. The first trigger pull produced a hesitant cough of movement, followed by a jam. The bolt had cycled halfway before stopping. A second attempt resulted in a partial burst, then complete stoppage. The mud had found its way into the internal parts just as easily as it had with the Sten. The British officers stood quietly. The failures of both weapons had created a new silence, one no longer built on skepticism, but on uneasy recognition. The mud acted without bias. It had no interest in reputations. It simply tested designs as they truly were, not as manufacturers described them. The officers now understood why this evaluation mattered. If existing weapons performed so poorly here, what would happen in the steaming jungles of New Guinea or Malaya, where rain and dirt were constant companions? Attention shifted toward the crate where the Owen gun waited. Its green paint gleamed faintly in the light. The top-mounted magazine gave it an unconventional shape, one that seemed almost experimental. No British officer expected much from it. Many assumed it would fail even faster than the others. Its origins were humble, and its creator lacked the prestige of established arms companies. Yet something about the weapon drew a quiet curiosity now. If the proven giants had struggled, perhaps the test held room for unexpected results. The Australian sergeant approached the crate and lifted the Owen gun with a steady grip. The weapon balanced easily. Its lines were plain but purposeful, with fewer external openings than other guns. It was placed near the mud pit without drama. The officers leaned slightly forward, tension building in small, controlled breaths. The moment had arrived to see whether this strange prototype would collapse under the same conditions or reveal something unusual hidden beneath its simple exterior. The test officer grasped the weapon firmly and lowered it slowly into the mud. The surface wrapped around it, pulling at the edges as if trying to swallow it whole. Mud seeped over the magazine, down the receiver, and across the barrel. Once submerged completely, the officer released it for a second, letting it rest under the surface like a drowned object forgotten in a swamp. Then he pulled it out and prepared for the next step. The impossible test was about to begin. The Owen gun hung in the test officer's hands for a moment as loose streams of mud slid from its receiver and dripped back into the pit. The air had grown warmer since the test began, but the atmosphere around the field felt strangely tight. The British officers no longer carried the relaxed posture of earlier. Their shoulders were still squared, their stance still proper, yet there was a sense of quiet tension beneath the surface. The failures of the Sten and the Thompson had unsettled them more than any of them cared to admit, and now they watched the Australian prototype with new, cautious interest. The officer held the Owen gun at waist height and let the last clumps of mud fall off. The weapon looked heavier now, burdened by layers of sticky earth clinging to the seams and grooves. Mud coated the magazine, the chamber edges, and the outer surface of the barrel shroud. The entire gun appeared as if it had been buried for a week, not dipped for a single test. It was the kind of condition that would cripple most firearms long before the first shot could even be attempted. A small crowd formed around the edge of the pit. The Australian soldiers who assisted earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces calm but observant. Some knew how the weapon performed in earlier trials, but none would break the silence. It was not the moment for chatter or smiles. This was the moment where the gun would either fail like the others or prove itself in a way that few thought possible. A thin gust of wind brushed across the field, carrying with it the scent of wet soil and eucalyptus leaves. The test officer stepped away from the pit and walked toward the sandbank where the previous test rounds had struck. Deep marks and scattered clumps of sand created a rough pattern near the base. He positioned his feet firmly, raised the weapon and supported it with both hands. The Owen gun pointed forward, its barrel darkened with mud, its magazine dripping sludge. The silence around him stretched long enough for a bird call in the distance to stand out, brief and fragile. Then the officer tightened his grip and pulled the trigger. A sudden burst of clean, rapid fire broke across the clearing. The gun cycled smoothly, expelling mud, water and gas with each shot. Mud blasted from the barrel shroud in tiny explosions as the weapon fully recovered its function. The sound was steady and uninterrupted, as if the gun had never touched the sludge at all. A full burst of ammunition ripped into the sandbank, throwing particles into the air with each impact. The onlookers froze. Even the wind seemed to quiet for a moment, allowing only the echo of the gun's fire to hang in the clearing. The British officers who had expected a jam found themselves staring with widened eyes. Those who tried to maintain a posture of discipline now held their arms stiffer than before, gripping their notebooks or holsters just a little tighter. The Australian soldiers glanced at one another with calm satisfaction, though no one spoke. The noise of the gun was explanation enough. The test officer released the trigger and stepped back to inspect the weapon. Smoke curled upward from the barrel. Mud continued to drip onto the ground. The magazine still gleamed faintly under its coating of dirt. Despite all this, the weapon remained perfectly functional. The officer did not need words to show his surprise. The careful way he turned the gun from side to side revealed it clearly enough. But the test was not finished. The procedure required harsher conditions. Mud alone proved the first point. Water would be next. The officer walked toward the deeper trough filled with dark, cool water. The surface shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting streaks of blue sky and scattered leaves floating gently on top. He knelt beside it, took one more glance at the observers, and lowered the gun into the trough. The water swallowed the weapon immediately. Bubbles rose from the trigger housing, and the barrel shroud as trapped air escaped. Mud from the previous test drifted slowly upward, creating ripples that spread across the surface. The gun remained underwater for several seconds, long enough for the British officers to exchange uneasy glances once again. Submerging a firearm after coating it in mud was something few weapons could endure. When the officer finally lifted the gun from the trough, water poured from the barrel in a long stream. The receiver shone momentarily before new mud from internal gaps mixed with the water and stained the surface again. The gun was heavier now from the added moisture, but the officer carried it with steady hands. He took a few steps back, let the last streams fall, and faced the sandbank once more. The weapon rose slowly, its barrel still dripping. Without hesitation, the officer pulled the trigger again. A new burst erupted, as clean and fast as the first. The water inside the barrel blasted outward in a white spray, scattering droplets into the air. The gun did not choke. It did not hesitate. It simply fired, cycling each round with mechanical precision. The recoil thumped gently into the officer's shoulder as he continued the burst, proving beyond question that the submersion had done nothing to slow its function. When the burst ended, another silence rolled across the clearing. This one felt heavier than before. It was not the silence of expectation, but the silence of realization. The British delegation no longer saw an odd Australian experiment. They saw a weapon that refused to die, a gun that seemed to ignore the laws that governed every other firearm they had tested. The officer placed the weapon on a crate, stepping back with a slow exhale. The Australian sergeant approached and examined the gun with practiced hands, checking the chamber, the bolt and the magazine. Everything worked. Everything remained intact. The test had not just demonstrated reliability, it had demonstrated superiority, under conditions the Sten and Thompson could not match. The British colonel in charge of the evaluation moved closer. His expression was calm but thoughtful. The results demanded attention, whether he liked them or not. He studied the mud pits, the water trough, and the sandbank riddled with holes. The pattern of impacts showed how consistently the Owen gun had fired, even under extreme conditions. There was no sign of hesitation in the burst patterns. Each cluster appeared tight and predictable. Across the field, some of the Australian soldiers exchanged looks of quiet pride. They had seen too many weapons jam in field training. They knew that jungle warfare demanded more than firepower. It demanded endurance. A reliable gun could save a patrol from ambush or allow soldiers to retreat under pressure. Mud and water were constant enemies in places where rain never stopped and the ground never dried. A weapon that survived both was more than a tool. It was a lifeline. The British officers began noting down details in their notebooks. Some wrote quickly, others slowly, but all of them now understood that the test had revealed a problem in their current equipment. If their troops were to fight in environments like the jungles of New Guinea or Borneo, their guns needed to function under conditions far worse than those found in Europe. The results of the morning test suggested that the Owen gun might be the answer to challenges none of them had fully prepared for. The test was not yet complete. According to procedure, sand would be added next, followed by additional mud and water cycles. The Owen gun would face each of these stages as the day continued. But the most important shift had already occurred. The officers no longer watched to see if the gun would fail. They now watched to see how much more it could endure. The impossible test had not broken the weapon. Instead, it had changed the expectations of everyone present. The trial was far from over, yet the story of the Owen gun had already begun to rewrite itself. The air over the test field changed after the first rounds from the Owen gun. It was not a loud change or something visible, but a shift in the way people stood and breathed. The British officers no longer leaned back or kept their arms folded with quiet confidence. Instead, they leaned forward, eyes narrowing with focus, not skepticism. A small uncertainty had taken root among them, and that uncertainty grew each time they replayed the previous burst of clean, unstoppable fire in their thoughts. The Australians noticed the shift, but kept their discipline. They knew more tests were coming, and the weapon's reputation had to survive all of them. The Australian sergeant in charge stepped toward the crate and retrieved the Owen gun again. The weapon's metal still glistened with water and traces of mud. The surface felt cool to the touch, but beneath the metal lay a warmth from the firing. The sergeant lifted the bolt, checked the chamber, and nodded slightly. Everything felt smooth. No grinding, no hesitation. The gun was still alive and ready. A few of the British officers stepped closer than before, watching the inspection with a new seriousness. For the next stage, the test required sand. Unlike mud, sand posed a different type of threat. It did not clog up barrels in thick clumps, but instead found its way into small gaps. It scraped against moving parts, scratched surfaces, and weakened the fit between pieces. Sand could choke a weapon slowly or quickly, depending on how it entered. Most guns hated it. Even sturdy rifles became unreliable if enough grains slipped inside. A large canvas bag of sand lay near the table. The grains were fine and pale, gathered from a nearby riverbed and dried under the morning sun. The test officer opened the bag and scooped a double handful of sand. He let it pour over the Owen gun's open bolt, watching the grains fall between the metal parts, slide along the grooves, and settle inside the receiver. More sand followed, poured across the magazine well and trigger housing. The gun became dusted in a bright coat that contrasted sharply against its olive-green frame. The officer did not shake it off. He simply closed the bolt with a firm, steady motion, trapping whatever grains had fallen inside. A soft scraping noise rose as the metal slid forward. It was not enough to stop movement, but enough to remind everyone that the weapon now held thousands of small obstacles within it. The gun was placed on the table for a moment. The British officers watched quietly, noting how the grains clung to the oiled surfaces. The test continued as the sergeant signaled for the next step. More sand was poured across the exterior. Some gathered around the trigger guard, some collected near the rear sights, and some stuck to the magazine. Only a few areas of green metal remained visible. The test officer picked up the gun again. Sand cascaded to the ground from the motion, but plenty remained embedded in the seams. He moved toward the sandbank once more, stepping carefully to avoid tripping over spent casings. The sun hung higher in the sky now, brightening the field and casting long, sharp shadows behind each person. Sweat formed on foreheads under stiff caps, though no one seemed to notice. Their attention stayed fixed on the weapon. The officer held the gun tightly, braced himself, and pulled the trigger. The burst that followed surprised even the Australians. The Owen gun fired not only cleanly but with a crisp, sharp rhythm. Sand sprayed outward from the barrel shroud in tiny sparks of dust. More grains flew from the bolt housing as the weapon cycled rapidly. The burst left a consistent pattern of holes in the sandbank, nearly identical to the earlier shots. The weapon behaved like a machine untouched by dirt, free of blockage and friction. The officers exchanged glances. Their earlier skepticism now looked misplaced. The Thompson had choked. The Sten had refused to fire. Yet here stood a gun that swallowed mud, drank water and inhaled sand without complaint. It continued firing with a mechanical certainty that defied every expectation placed upon it. But the test still had not reached its harshest stage. The Australian sergeant ordered the weapon returned to the mud pit. The officer dipped it once more, deeper this time, leaving it submerged long enough for bubbles to stop rising. When he removed it, the sand trapped inside mixed with the mud, turning into a thick, abrasive paste. It dripped slowly along the sides, as if the gun had been buried for days rather than seconds. Another immersion followed, this time into the water trough. Mud and sand spiraled inside the clear water, forming cloudy swirls around the steel. The mixture crept into every opening. Sand settled in the grooves. Mud pushed into the bolt channel. When the gun was lifted out again, it resembled a tool recovered from a sunken trench rather than a modern weapon. The officer stepped back toward the sandbank. The British officers drew closer, tension rising in steady waves. Some scribbled quick notes, though many forgot their notebooks altogether. Their eyes were fixed on the weapon, not on their paperwork. The Australians stood silently, waiting. The gun rose slowly, barrel dripping with watery grit. The officer exhaled once, steadying his hands. Then he squeezed the trigger. Again the weapon fired. The burst began slightly rougher than before as the gun expelled the mud-water mixture trapped inside. But within a fraction of a second, the rhythm stabilized. The cycling became smooth. The recoil remained consistent. The bolt moved rapidly despite sand grinding beneath it. The sound of the firing carved through the field with a sharp, confident tone. No stoppage followed. No interruption broke the pattern. The impossible combination of mud, water and sand had failed to halt the weapon. The officers' reactions were more visible this time. Eyebrows rose. Mouths tightened. One of them shifted his stance unconsciously, stepping forward, as if pulled by the realization forming in his mind. The superiority of the Owen gun was no longer a surprise. It was a threat to assumptions they had carried for years. A weapon without prestige, crafted in a small workshop, had outperformed established designs made by larger, older, more respected manufacturers. The sergeant collected the weapon once again. He cycled the bolt, clearing excess muck. The motion remained smooth, though faint scratching from the sand could be heard. Even so, the mechanism worked. Nothing had jammed. Nothing had bent. The weapon remained ready. The British colonel finally approached the table, studying the weapon closely. His face held the calm authority expected of his rank, but a quiet intensity lay beneath his eyes. He traced the outline of the top-mounted magazine, examined the sealed bolt housing, and paused near the ventilation slots. The design choices that once seemed eccentric now appeared deliberate. The Owen gun had survived not because of chance, but because it had been engineered with the jungle in mind. The engineers from the British delegation noted the internal simplicity. Fewer openings for dirt to enter, a bolt that moved vertically away from mud, trapped near the magazine, a strong grip enhanced by the weapon's balanced center. Everything served the same goal: reliability in harsh conditions. The Australian sergeant rotated the weapon so more officers could inspect it. Some leaned close, studying the mud still clinging to the seams. Others examined the scratches left by sand. The weapon bore marks of abuse, but no sign of mechanical failure. It stood alive and steady, as if eager for the next challenge. The day was far from over. More rounds would be fired. More combinations of dirt and water would be tested. But the essential truth had already emerged. The Owen gun did not merely survive the impossible test. It dominated it. Every failure from the Sten and the Thompson now felt heavier, because the Owen gun made those failures look avoidable. The British officers exchanged unspoken conclusions. Their weapons might work in European towns and open fields, but the Pacific was different. There mud clung to legs like chains, water drenched gear every morning. Sand blew across beaches in relentless waves. If a gun could not withstand that environment, then it could not serve the men who carried it. The Owen gun had shown that it could endure all of it. The impossible test had become a turning point, not only for the weapon but for the officers watching. Their assumptions had cracked, and the cracks widened with every successful burst. In the quiet that followed, everyone present understood a single truth. The Owen gun was no longer an experiment. It had become a contender, one capable of changing the war that waited beyond the jungles and islands. The test field slowly returned to quiet after the final burst from the Owen gun. The echoes faded into the surrounding forest, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. Yet the silence felt different now. It no longer carried the weight of tension. Instead, it held the weight of realization. Something important had happened on this patch of muddy ground, something that would ripple far beyond the test site. The British officers stood still for several moments, trying to process what they had witnessed. The Australian sergeant lifted the Owen gun once more. Mud and water still clung to the weapon, forming small rivulets that slid along the metal and dripped onto the dirt below. The gun felt heavier than before, not from damage but from the weight of attention it now carried. Every eye in the clearing followed it. The sergeant placed it on a wooden crate and stepped back, giving the officers space to approach. They moved closer slowly, as if approaching a machine that had defied natural rules. The colonel who oversaw the evaluation finally reached out and grasped the receiver. His gloves became smeared with mud instantly, but he did not appear to care. He inspected the top-mounted magazine first. Its placement had been the subject of many jokes in earlier briefings. Some officers had claimed it made the weapon look upside down. Others believed such a design would cause balance problems. Now the colonel understood its purpose. With the magazine sitting above the bolt, gravity helped keep debris away from the feeding path. Mud that collected beneath the weapon never touched the ammunition. Water that flowed down the sides washed away from the bolt instead of into it. The colonel moved his attention to the bolt housing. Unlike the Sten, which featured open slots that invited dirt into its mechanism, the Owen gun had a sealed channel. Small gaps were positioned deliberately to allow internal pressure to push debris out. The more the gun fired, the cleaner it became. The Australian engineers had built a system that forced mud away instead of allowing it to accumulate. It was not fancy engineering, but it was smart, clever in a way that came from experience rather than textbooks. The British officers exchanged notes, while the Australian sergeant explained the simplicity of the internal parts. The bolt moved vertically in a tight track. The springs were strong but not delicate. The trigger system relied on fewer pieces than most other submachine guns. Everything inside had been designed with the idea that mud would always try to get in. Every choice, from the shape of the bolt to the placement of the magazine latch, came from the same guiding thought. The jungle was cruel, and the weapon had to be even tougher. The sky brightened as the sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened around the clearing. Sweat gathered on the brows of soldiers standing nearby, though no one broke formation. The officers continued their quiet investigation. Some knelt to examine the mud pit. Others inspected the sandbank where the bursts had struck. They studied the patterns, looking for signs of inconsistency or wild movement. What they found instead were tight clusters that proved stable control even under filthy conditions. The field test had ended, but the implications had just begun to settle in. Across the world, the Pacific War was growing more intense. The Japanese advance had cut through Malaya, the Philippines, and parts of the Dutch East Indies with alarming speed. Rain-soaked jungles dominated many of the battlefields. Monsoon downpours turned footpaths into rivers. Thick fog rolled through valleys. Moss, mud, and insects covered everything soldiers carried. Rifles rusted. Ammunition swelled. Metal corroded. A weapon that jammed at the wrong moment could cost entire patrols their lives. Reports from early fighting painted a clear picture. European-designed weapons struggled terribly in tropical conditions. The Sten, for all its usefulness in European cities, fared poorly in the jungle. Its open bolt channel collected water easily. Its magazine was sensitive to dirt. Sand clogged the feed lips. Soldiers often found themselves clearing jams with knives or sticks, while enemy scouts moved closer. The Thompson, though more durable, was heavy and difficult to maintain during long patrols. Its complexity made it harder to clean thoroughly. Mud that entered its internal parts sometimes hardened before a soldier even had time to disassemble the weapon. The British officers at the test site now understood how serious these problems had become. They had received reports before, But those reports never carried the same weight as watching a weapon fail in front of them. Paper could be ignored. A jammed gun in their hands could not. The colonel looked again at the Owen gun resting on the crate. The design that once seemed crude now appeared purposeful. The simple shape and plain metal finish made it look less glamorous than foreign weapons, but glamour did not keep soldiers alive. Reliability did. The colonel imagined a patrol moving through a jungle track, soaked in rain, covered in dirt, fighting through thick roots and waist-deep mud. The only weapon suited for such terrain would be the one that fired every time its trigger was pulled. Another British officer examined the weapon's weight. Though it looked heavy, it balanced well. The top-mounted magazine gave it a stable center. Soldiers could hold it steady even while tired from marching. The wooden stock felt comfortable, shaped for long hours of movement. Nothing about the gun felt fragile or overly complicated. It worked because it was simple. The colonel knew the next step was not just technical analysis. It was strategic. If the Owen gun could perform in jungle environments as well as it had in the field test, then the British and Australian forces needed to adopt it quickly. They needed large numbers, and they needed them soon. The war in New Guinea was already turning into a battle of endurance. Soldiers moving through rainforests fought both the enemy and the environment. A gun that did not jam under harsh conditions could tip the balance in dozens of engagements. The Australian military representatives waited for the verdict, though no formal announcement would come that day. Decisions of this scale required reports, signatures, approvals, and logistics. Even so, the sense of change hovered in the air. The test had been more than a routine evaluation. It had been a demonstration of survival. The Owen gun had endured every challenge thrown at it, and now the higher command would have to reconsider their previous doubts. As the officers finished their inspection, they moved toward the edge of the field to discuss their findings. Their voices remained low, but their expressions revealed deep thought. Many had expected the day to confirm their existing beliefs. Instead, the day had forced them to reconsider not only weapons design, but their assumptions about jungle warfare. Technology built for European battlefields did not automatically suit the Pacific. Even the most prestigious weapons could fail when exposed to the unpredictability of tropical climates. The Australian sergeant watched from a distance as the officers conferred. He felt a quiet pride, not for himself but for the small team that had worked on the Owen gun during its early stages. The design had not come from a large factory. It had come from the hands of people who understood the realities of their environment. They knew the jungle would not forgive a complicated gun. They built something that could survive it. The British colonel finally looked back at the field one more time. The mud pit still glistened under the sun. The water trough settled into stillness. The sandbag lay half empty. Every part of the test area told the story of what had unfolded. A crude-looking weapon had outlasted two giants. It had proven itself not with elegance, but with persistence. Across the ocean, the jungles of New Guinea waited. Soldiers fought through rain and darkness, relying on whatever equipment they carried. A weapon like the Owen gun could change the way those battles unfolded. It could help patrols survive ambushes. It could keep firepower alive in conditions that killed other guns. It could shift the momentum of the entire campaign. The colonel understood this now. The test field had revealed the truth. The Owen gun was not merely a local invention. It was a weapon made for a war that demanded toughness above all else. The jungle would break many things, but the Owen gun was not one of them. The jungles of New Guinea were nothing like the quiet clearing where the Owen gun had proven itself. The test field had mud pits, water troughs, and bags of sand arranged in neat lines. New Guinea offered far worse. The ground swallowed boots to the ankle. The air carried thick moisture that clung to every surface. Rain fell in sheets that turned footpaths into rivers within minutes. Even the trees seemed to drip constantly, creating a world where nothing ever dried. Soldiers moving through this landscape learned quickly that the jungle punished everything they carried. It was in this setting that the Owen gun first entered combat. Australian infantry patrols pushed through narrow tracks bordered by dense vegetation. Vines hung low, waiting to catch on equipment. Ferns and roots covered the ground in uneven layers. Each step required caution. Visibility often stretched no more than a few meters, forcing soldiers to listen more than they looked. The enemy could appear suddenly, emerging from shadows and foliage without warning. Every sound mattered: a snapped twig, a shifting leaf, the soft slide of mud underfoot. Before the Owen gun reached these units, many soldiers struggled with their existing weapons. The Thompson's weight made long patrols exhausting. The Sten, though light, suffered badly whenever rain or dirt entered its openings. Reports described bolts locked in place after only a short time in the field. Soldiers sometimes had to knock mud from their guns using stones or machete handles. Clearing jams became a routine action, done even in dangerous moments. The jungle did not care whether a soldier needed his weapon urgently. It simply filled every gap with moisture and grit. When the first crates of Owen guns arrived near forward positions, the soldiers treated them with curiosity. The guns looked unusual, with their top-mounted magazines and plain finish. They did not have the polished appearance of American weapons or the familiar structure of British designs. Yet early patrols quickly learned that appearance mattered little here. What mattered was whether a weapon fired when needed, even after crawling through mud or hiding in a ditch during a downpour. Small reconnaissance groups received the first shipments. These groups often operated ahead of main forces, moving through dense foliage and mapping enemy positions. They carried light gear and depended heavily on their weapons. On their first outing with the Owen guns, they moved along a narrow ridge soaked from a recent storm. Water dripped down the steep sides and pooled around the roots of tall trees. Every soldier's uniform was already wet, but they pressed forward. As the patrol advanced, rain began again, falling in heavy, warm sheets. It soaked the men instantly. Water streamed down their helmets, dripped along their sleeves, and collected inside their boots. The Owen guns grew wet as well, with water pouring into every small depression along the metal. Mud splashed upward as boots lifted and fell. Under normal circumstances, this combination of wet and dirt would have caused immediate trouble for older weapons. But the patrol kept moving. Their guns held comfortably across their chests. Later in the day, the patrol approached a clearing where Japanese soldiers had been spotted. The clearing looked peaceful at first, covered with ferns and low bushes. Then a sudden burst of movement revealed an enemy scouting party positioned near fallen logs. Both sides saw each other almost at the same moment. What followed happened quickly and without room for hesitation. The Australians raised their Owen guns. Mud dripped from the stocks and receivers. Rainwater slid along the barrels. Yet when the triggers were pulled, the guns responded immediately. Burst after burst cut through the clearing, slicing through leaves and branches. The sound rose above the rain, sharp and stable, without any sign of sluggish cycling. Mud that clung to the barrels flew outward with each shot. The bolts moved cleanly, unaffected by the dirt inside. The guns behaved as if rehearsing the same performance seen earlier in the test field. The Japanese scouts fired back, but their rifles struggled in the heavy rain. Water had soaked their ammunition pouches. Some cartridges misfired. The Australians' reliable weapons gave them a clear advantage. The firefight ended swiftly. When the patrol regrouped, the soldiers examined their own guns. They found mud in the grooves and water pooled around the trigger housings. Yet the Owen guns had not faltered once. This encounter became the first of many similar stories. Word spread quickly among infantry units. Soldiers in the front lines began requesting the new Australian-made gun, especially those who worked in small patrol groups or carried out nighttime movements. The gun's ease of use appealed to them. Its simple design meant fewer parts to worry about. The top-mounted magazine allowed them to fire around obstacles more easily while staying low to the ground. In the days that followed, the rain continued, turning trails into deep channels of brown water. Patrols had to wade across streams that rose suddenly and without warning. Many weapons dipped below the surface during these crossings. Rifles and submachine guns that entered the water often needed immediate cleaning. But the Owen gun showed a different behavior. Soldiers pulled it from the water, shook it once, and carried on without issue. Some units even performed quick tests by firing a few rounds after a stream crossing, just to confirm the gun's reliability. The bullets left the barrel without hesitation every time. During one extended patrol, an ambush occurred near the base of a ridge where the rainforest grew particularly thick. The Australians moved carefully, stepping over fallen logs and pushing aside heavy leaves. The air was hot and dense, making it hard to breathe. Sweat mixed with rain until everything felt like a warm, wet blanket, clinging to the skin. It was late afternoon, and the light filtering through the canopy grew dim. As the patrol reached a narrow bend between two large tree trunks, the jungle around them erupted with sudden gunfire. Japanese soldiers hidden in concealed pits opened fire. The Australians dropped to cover, sliding into the mud behind exposed roots and low mounds of dirt. Several soldiers ended up fully submerged in shallow puddles as they tried to find better positions. The Owen guns were dragged through mud, slammed against tree bark and pressed into wet ground during the scramble. But when the Australians counterattacked, the weapons fired immediately once more. Burst after burst pushed the enemy back. The guns shed mud as they fired, clearing their own barrels and shrouds through recoil and gas pressure. Soldiers trusted their weapons in a way they had not experienced before. They no longer worried whether a burst would jam halfway or whether the bolt would stick at the worst moment. The ambush was repelled, and the patrol managed to regroup. When they examined their equipment afterward, they found thick mud stuck to the weapons. The bolts still moved smoothly. A few soldiers dipped their guns in a nearby puddle just to rinse them off, confident the weapon would continue working afterward. They were right. The guns remained functional. Back at larger encampments, officers collected reports from each patrol. The repeated successes drew increasing attention. Every report highlighted the same qualities: the gun fired after rain, after mud, after submersion, and after long marches. The stories matched the results from the earlier field tests, but seeing them confirmed in real combat carried far more weight. The Japanese soldiers often carried bolt-action rifles or light machine guns that required careful maintenance. Many of these weapons struggled in dense jungle environments. The Australians, armed with a gun built to survive the worst conditions, found themselves with a distinct advantage in close-range engagements where reaction time mattered most. The Owen gun allowed them to respond quickly, stay mobile and fire confidently, even when covered in dirt. As the front lines shifted and patrols pushed deeper into the jungle, the demand for the Owen gun grew rapidly. Supply officers struggled to keep up. Workshops in Australia began increasing production. Engineers made small adjustments to improve mass manufacturing, but the core design remained unchanged. Its strength lay in its simplicity. The Australian High Command sent updated reports to British headquarters, describing the gun's performance. British commanders who had once doubted the weapon now faced mounting evidence. The field test had not been a lucky demonstration. It had been an accurate prediction of how the gun would behave under real combat stress. The jungle had become the ultimate judge, and it had given the Owen gun its approval. As battles continued along the Kokoda track and across the surrounding hills and valleys, the weapon proved itself again and again. Soldiers trusted it, officers relied on it, and the war in the Pacific began to shift in ways that reflected the advantages of equipment built for survival, not appearance. The impossible test had not just revealed a strong weapon, it had revealed the right weapon. And the world was beginning to understand the difference. The success of the Owen gun in the jungles of New Guinea traveled quickly across military channels. Reports moved from field officers to headquarters, then across desks in Australia, and finally to British command posts far from the front lines. Each report repeated the same points with growing confidence. The weapon worked after rain. It worked after mud. It worked after falling into streams or being dragged through foliage. It worked after soldiers crawled through undergrowth or slid down slopes during ambushes. It continued firing when other guns jammed. No matter how harsh the conditions became, the Owen gun behaved as if the jungle could not touch it. In contrast, the performance of the Sten and the Thompson under real combat pressure worried many officers. Soldiers who once trusted these weapons now approached patrols with caution, checking bolts repeatedly and clearing dirt from openings whenever they stopped. The jungle forced them to slow down and handle their guns carefully. This slowed reaction time and exposed them to danger during sudden firefights. Weapons meant for European cities simply could not adapt to tropical climates without constant attention. The Australian High Command studied these reports closely. Officers visited frontline units to observe how soldiers used the guns. They watched patrols moving through swamps, crossing streams and pushing through vines as thick as ropes. The patrols carried Owen guns confidently, knowing that their weapons would not betray them. Soldiers showed officers how easily the gun handled in tight spaces, how quickly it could be raised for close combat, and how steady it remained during long bursts. These observations became part of official briefings presented to higher command. Meanwhile, British commanders in the region compared the new evidence to their earlier expectations. Many had doubted the gun during its testing stage, believing it to be too plain, too simple, or too unrefined to offer real advantages. Yet the jungle made its own rules. Prestige meant nothing against humidity and mud. Even the best engineered European weapons failed when clogged with roots, sand, and moisture. The Owen gun reflected a rare truth. Simple designs often survived best in complex environments. As the reports accumulated, a shift began to form in military planning. The British command recognized that the Pacific theater required a new approach. Weapons designed for Europe needed to be re-evaluated, and equipment better suited for tropical warfare needed to be prioritized. The Owen gun became the center of these discussions. Its success forced officers to reconsider everything, from supply lines to frontline tactics. A reliable weapon in the jungle could influence patrol behavior, ambush survival rates, and even the pace of offensives. By mid-campaign, requests for Owen guns increased sharply. Australian workshops expanded production. Engineers refined assembly lines, not to change the weapon but to produce it faster. The core mechanism remained untouched because every part performed exactly as needed. Workers cleaned metal parts, fitted bolts, attached stocks, and loaded magazines with practiced movements. Crates filled with completed guns were transported by truck, then by ship, then by smaller craft moving toward forward supply posts. The demand also came from units outside Australia. Some British units stationed in the Pacific requested trials. New Zealand forces expressed interest as well. Although production limits prevented immediate widespread distribution, many officers began discussing the possibility of larger-scale adoption. The weapon's reputation had spread far beyond the initial test field. As more guns reached the front, soldiers began to treat the Owen gun as a trusted companion. It accompanied them on night patrols, where visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the sound of distant movement kept nerves tight. It accompanied them through steep ridges, where every step risked sliding into hidden drops. It accompanied them during long marches, where sweat soaked through uniforms and insects swarmed around exposed skin. No matter how exhausted the men became, the gun performed with the same steady rhythm. Some stories from the front described near-miraculous moments where the gun saved entire patrols. Soldiers told of situations where jams could have meant death, yet the Owen gun fired without pause. One group reported surviving a nighttime ambush because their guns responded immediately, while the enemy struggled to chamber rounds in wet rifles. Another patrol described climbing out of a flooded gully, shaking mud from their boots, and instantly opening fire on enemy scouts thanks to guns that stayed functional even after being submerged. These accounts added human weight to the earlier reports. They transformed raw numbers into experiences. Officers reading the reports no longer saw them as technical evaluations. They saw them as evidence of survival. The Owen gun was no longer just a weapon. It had become something soldiers relied on to return home alive. The growing recognition reached British command centres. Meetings were held where officers reviewed the field results. Charts compared jam rates, maintenance requirements, and battlefield performance. Each chart showed the same pattern. The Owen gun outperformed its rivals consistently. Even senior officers who once viewed the gun with skepticism now found themselves reconsidering their previous assessments. The weapon's success was undeniable. As the campaign progressed, the shift in doctrine became clearer. Units equipped with Owen guns moved more confidently through thick foliage. They engaged enemy forces at shorter distances without hesitation. Supply officers adjusted their priorities, ensuring that maintenance tools, spare magazines, and extra ammunition for the Owen gun were included in shipments. Training officers introduced new drills tailored to the gun's handling characteristics. The entire structure of frontline operations began to adjust around the weapon. In Australia, officials sent official recommendations to expand production even further. They proposed forming specialized units equipped primarily with Owen guns to handle jungle reconnaissance missions. These units would exploit the gun's strengths in terrain that caused other weapons to fail. The idea gained traction quickly, as field officers supported the proposal. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the gun also influenced long-term planning. Military engineers in Britain and other allied nations began reconsidering their design priorities. Reliability in extreme environments became a new focus. Designers studied the Owen gun closely, noting its sealed bolt, top-mounted magazine, and simple internal mechanisms. Some early proposals for future guns incorporated similar features. The influence of the Owen gun extended far beyond Australia's borders. By the end of the campaign, the gun had earned a reputation that few weapons ever achieved. Soldiers spoke of it with respect. Officers recommended it in reports. Commanders approved increased distribution. The gun had proven itself not only in tests, but in real combat where lives depended on every trigger pull. The British High Command finally issued a formal acknowledgement. The Owen gun was to be accepted as a frontline weapon for units operating in the Pacific. The decision came after months of evidence, but to those who had seen the weapon in action, the approval felt inevitable. The jungle had tested every weapon harshly, and the Owen gun had emerged as the only one truly built for such an environment. When crates of Owen guns arrived in British forward bases later, soldiers recognized them immediately. They carried the guns with the same confidence Australian troops had shown months earlier. The weapon no longer belonged to a single nation. It belonged to the men who needed it most, those who fought in heat, rain, mud, and darkness. In the end, the Owen gun did more than pass a test. It changed doctrine. It changed equipment decisions. It changed how armies thought about survival in extreme conditions. And it proved something simple yet unforgettable. Sometimes the smallest, most unlikely tool becomes the one that reshapes an entire war. The impossible test had not just stunned commanders. It had transformed their understanding of what mattered most. Not appearance, not prestige, reliability.